We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Roanoke College Alumni Association NOKELive series. Today is our second live event, and we will be continuing weekly with live events to include featured webinars, film and book discussions, and more. You can visit the Alumni Hub page on our Roanoke College website at www.roanoke.edu/alumni. I am Sally Logan Walker, and I hold the position of Director of Alumni and Donor Relations here at Roanoke College. It is my pleasure to host today's webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to cover just a couple logistical points. You all are viewing today's live webinar via YouTube, and you can use the chat feature to submit questions to our presenter. At the conclusion of her comments today, we will present her the questions, and she will be able to answer those as we present them. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be available beginning tomorrow on the Roanoke College Alumni Hub, as well as on this Alumni Association YouTube channel. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alice Kassens. I'd like to share with you a little bit about her bio. She is the John S. Shannon Professor of Economics here at Roanoke College, a senior analyst with the Institute for Policy and Opinion Research, Director of the Center for Economic Freedom, member of the Governor's Joint Advisory Board of Economists, and a past president of the Virginia Association of Economists. She produces the quarterly reports on consumer sentiment, inflation expectations, and real estate indexes for Virginia. She is currently working on several manuscripts regarding health in developing countries. Additionally, her book, The Intemperance Movement: Economic Adaptation to Prohibition, was published last summer in August of 2019. Dr. Kassens earned her BA in Economics and History from the College of William and Mary and her PhD in Economics from North Carolina State University. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Alice Kassens for your comments today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sally, and welcome everybody. I am going to take a moment to share my screen because I do have some slides prepared for all of us, so bear with me when I get that going. If it's going to do that for me. Michael. Okay. All right, here we go. All right, so as what Sally mentioned, this is our commentary, or I'm going to talk about the economics of coronavirus and things that the impact that it's had on our economy. I'm going to focus on the national economy since there could be people from all over. I won't be talking about Virginia, but I will every once in a while drop in some little tidbits about Virginia, just so I can flesh that out, because we do a fair amount of analysis at IPOR about the Virginia economy. So without further ado, don't need to talk about the welcome. Sally did such a great job introducing me and talking about who I am. The goals for this session is I'm going to lay out some common economic measures that we use to measure the well-being of the economy. So think about it going to a doctor's office and they take your blood pressure and your pulse. There are various basic measures that we use to be able to get a read on the health of the economy. So I'm going to go over those. Some are ones you have heard about on the news quite a bit, and we'll kind of delve into what they mean and how coronavirus, how we can measure what happened to the economy through them. And then also some newer measures that I've started using that have been made available because of the wonderful technology that we have nowadays. So we'll have some new things. And the basis that I'm going to be coming from is that before coronavirus, our economy was incredibly strong. We had strong fundamentals. So unlike other recessions, that we've had, where there was some underlying flaw with the economy, sometimes more than one flaw, that sunk us into recession, including the 2007 recession, which was very long. This has been a period in which we were thrown into recession because we were asked to stay at home. This was not an economic issue at its source. Rather, it was almost a natural disaster, if you will. But it didn't destroy infrastructure, right? So our rebound from this recession is going to be much faster. And my computer always does this. Is going to be much faster than our typical recession. Typical recovery. So bear with me if my computer keeps flipping out. I think it's quite old and it has coronavirus perhaps. I'm also going to offer what I think these measures say about so giving you kind of my insights. So not based on facts that we see, but rather some forecasting. And of course, with any forecast, there's going to be potential for error, and I claim them all to be my own. So some of the economic measures we're going to talk about today are, and I'll explain each of these as we get to them, the unemployment rate, and another labor market measure, labor force participation, and then initial unemployment insurance claims. And then we'll also get to something we call soft data, and that the data is from largely or completely from survey measures. That's consumer sentiment. And that's where I will add a little bit about Virginia, just because we also measure consumer sentiment in the Commonwealth. And then we'll get to some of our new measures. So looking at gross domestic product, not to lay out too much boring jargon, but just so you know what we're talking about today, or when they talk about it on the news, the definition is there at the very top of the screen, measure for the entire economy. And it's the way that we measure not only how much we're spending, but also how much money the economy is worth, if you will. And so it's a great measure for looking at that measure by person. So it gives you a measure of household income, so on and so forth. And for our purposes, it is the measure that is used to gauge whether or not we're in a recession or not. That is the measure that's used. And in fact, just yesterday, the National Bureau of Economic Research announced that we were officially in a recession beginning in February, no surprise to anyone, and that they suspect we are already out of it. So it may have been one of our shortest recessions ever. Here's a little bit of data, and this is what I'm going to do for most of the session. I just pulled some information from, most of it from the Federal Reserve Economic Data Set called FRED by all of us. And this is just showing you the percentage change in GDP quarter on quarter. So what was the change from the fourth quarter of 2019, for example, to the first quarter of 2020? And that is actually the most recent number we have, since we're not yet done with this quarter. And so not surprisingly, if this is a measure that we use to indicate a recession, our GDP fell 5% between the fourth quarter, so the end of 2019, and the very beginning of 2020. Again, not a shock, but that is the number that we put on it as measured by gross domestic product. And on this graphic, you may wonder, what is all this business with these shaded lines, et cetera? Well, the shading spaces throughout this presentation indicate when we've been in a recession. So you can see clearly the 2007 to 2009 recession, that's that big gray box. And you see GDP fell almost 8% at its peak. Now that was a very long recession. Right now, we've only been in this recession for a quarter. And so our drop by 5%, well, not as much as we fell in 2007, we've almost fallen by that percentage point in just one quarter, but just for comparison purposes. And then the only other recession I have, because I only have this data going back to 2000, is that early small recession in the early 2000s when the tech bubble burst, right? And that black line is just the zero line, and that indicates the economy is just staying put. Right? So we'd like to be above that black line and having positive growth. And so we hope to be back there soon. Now, if we think about gross domestic product, it's made up of all the spending of everyone in the economy. And you may be surprised to know that the biggest share of gross domestic product is the spending that we all do. We call that consumption, personal consumption expenditures. If we had to pick a number on average, we make up, so all of our spending, utilities, groceries, so on and so forth, makes up 70% of total spending in the economy. So it's not the government, it's not investors and business folks, it's us, right? And so when we don't go to the stores and buy things, it has a big drain on the economy. So what you see here are actually dollars of consumption over the same time period from 2002 actually to the current period. And you can see that consumption fell over $1.5 trillion between March and April. So just a 1 month reduction, right? And so if you think about March to April is when we really started shutting the economy down. I know personally, Roanoke College shut down and we went home. So that was happening across the country and people were not going to stores because they were worried. So not a big surprise to see that consumption fell. And that's the biggest reason why GDP fell and we went into recession. So there were expansions in government spending, for example, but that is trumped by the reduction in consumption by all of us. So how are we going to get out of this recession if we're not already out of it? It's by us going back to the stores. And unlike most recessions where people don't have money to spend, this past recession, we were told to stay home. So a lot of fiscal policy was aimed at keeping people at home and not going to the stores. And now that that's over, we hope to see people returning to stores as states open up across the country. Now, this is a chart that I combined a couple of things, including gross domestic product, which is that green line you see here, but with two predictions that we have, because the question is what's happened to GDP between March and now. And so, of course, all of those are going to be guesses. And so some of the guesses we have access to are one measure by the St. Louis Fed, and then there's another measure, one's called a nowcast. And some of these use information from news sources. So it's trying to get a feel for how things are going, but then also looking at various hard and soft data pieces, but making a one quarter projection into the future. And so if you look at that line, you can see that we are projected, they have different measures of projection downwards, but we are expected to decline into the second quarter. So these measures are using largely hard and soft data, but monthly measures that we get and using them in a model to predict what GDP is going to be at the end of the second quarter. So not surprising, still falling, but perhaps not as badly as we did in the first quarter. And so just to take a step back, what do I think this stuff tells us about the economy moving forward? I would say, based upon not just my observations, but what some other economists are saying, is that the recession, if it's not already over, it's going to be over very soon. So it's going to be one of our shortest. Now, keep in mind, when an economist says a recession, they mean GDP falling, so a negative GDP growth rate. So meaning I don't think that's going to continue for very long. The bigger question is, when will we return to our pre-COVID levels? Because that's when our economy was moving along steadily. And so most of the estimates I see and what I believe is that we'll return to pre-COVID levels within a year or two. So recession should be over by the end of this quarter, if not the next, but it's going to take us a little bit, but certainly not as long as is traditional to get out of a recession. If you recall the 2007 to 2009 recession, it took us many years, if not a decade, to fully get out of that recession. So it's not going to be like that. And again, it is because our economy had strong fundamentals. So there wasn't a banking crisis and things like that underlying the crumble. I believe that our recession, our growth is going to be driven as usual by our spending. So as we return to restaurants, grocery stores, going on trips, as those things begin to happen more and more, that spending is going to improve our economy. Now, there are some caveats. Of course, this virus is new. We don't know much about it. And so one issue is going to be, are we going to have a revisit of this virus in the fall moving into the winter? If that's so, it could be set us back a little bit and thus take longer to recover. When we get a vaccine, that obviously will be great news for us, because then we can, as that vaccine gets distributed across people in our country, we can keep it from the virus from having this repeated effect on us. So those are some important caveats that I don't think anyone knows. Are we going to have a repeat in the fall or not? Certainly even schools and businesses don't know. So we'll wait and see. So my estimates are based on us not having a big reemergence of the virus. Now, another important area, especially for households, when you're thinking about an economy and its health and well-being, is how is the labor market doing? And so the labor market is a market just like anything else. And it's a lot of households. So we supply our labor, and businesses demand our labor. So they interact, and we have this thing called a labor market in which our wages and salaries and benefits are determined. And so these are another set of measures, these labor market indicators, that can tell us about the well-being of the economy. So we can move away from spending and look at, do we have jobs or not? Because of course, that is going to be tied closely to if we're going to spend money. And I always pull this when I've done webinars. I've done a few talking about this crisis that we're in. And this is a screenshot of the unemployment claims report for March, the week ending March 21st. Up until that point, if you just kind of, I don't know if your screen is so small you can't read it, but up until that point, our highest level of initial, so new unemployment claims, was under 700,000, right? We blew up from 282,000 to over 3 million, right? So this was just catastrophic. But again, it's because this recession was something different. Businesses were shut down because of the virus, bad economy. So that sent a lot of us great concern, because initial claims, so those are people who are newly uninsured and making claims for unemployment insurance, was higher than we had ever seen since we've been keeping these statistics. And we haven't had unemployment insurance forever. So that would be the highest that we've ever seen in the US. So what's happened since then? So that was that big week, and I pointed it out on this graph. You can see that steady level that we've been at during our expansion, so around 200 to 300,000 new claims, and then it just blew up to 3.2, and then it continued to climb. So you can see as we move through the end of March, that was still climbing. And then we've received good news throughout April, May, and June that those claims have started to decline. Right? So they're still over our previous record, but they are beginning to decline. So that, again, is not surprising, because as we see businesses opening back up, they're hiring employees, and so people are no longer on or getting new unemployment insurance claims. But it was quite a shock to the system, and some of you may have read they even had trouble with the computer systems, just because they had never had this many people making claims all at once, and the code that the unemployment insurance webpage is written on is stuff from the 1960s. So it's actually a group of older gentlemen in Texas that had to come to the rescue, because they're the only ones that know COBOL. All right, so another measure of, so we have initial claims, we saw that skyrocketed. Two other measures that are important to look at together. Unfortunately, you frequently only hear one or the other by themselves and not together, is the unemployment rate, which is the share of people who can work, who do not have a job but are actively seeking work. That is the unemployment rate. And then the labor force participation rate. That's the share of people who are either unemployed or employed that are in our working age population. And here so these numbers might not match up to the ones you typically see, because I pulled these only for prime age working adults. So it's only roughly 25 to 54-year-olds, not the entire span 16 to 64 that's usually reported, because this is the basis of our economy right here, this group, 25 to 54-year-olds. So what we've seen is not surprising. Unemployment rate skyrocketed as people were losing their jobs, and the labor force participation rate was declining, which is the reverse of what we had seen throughout the expansion. Right after the last recession, which is that gray bar, we were seeing unemployment rates slowly began to decline. They are a lagging economic indicator, so you can see the labor market didn't really start to recover until 2011-ish. And then labor force participation rate started to increase. So more people started coming into the labor force looking for work. So you imagine if you hadn't looked for work for a year because there weren't many options, the minute you start looking, you are now considered in the labor force and unemployed. So it can make that unemployment rate go up. So when we hit coronavirus, we saw the unemployment rate take a huge jump. Right? It went up to over 16%. Here again, we're looking just at prime age adults, so it was lower than that. And the labor force participation rate also took a dip. So that means people were losing their jobs and they weren't looking for them, right? So that's a bad combination. And while you have to look at these two together. Now, in the most recent report, so on the first Friday of every month is when the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases this information. They're in the same report, the Employment Situation Report. We found that the unemployment rate had dropped significantly. It's still much higher than we're used to, but it did take a big drop, and labor force participation increased. Right? So that means people are moving from being unemployed to employed, and there are people entering into the labor force who weren't before. So that's good news. That means people are hopeful that they're going to get a job, so they're entering the labor market, and those that are looking are finding jobs. So this is the path to recovery, to see those metrics going in that direction. So if we take a step back and look at the labor market always takes longer to rebound than our income, gross domestic product does. And that's because businesses are cautious. They don't know if we're going to have a resurgence of this virus. So they may wait to fully hire on their full staff, right? Until they know that we aren't going to have a resurgence, because it's expensive for businesses to hire workers and to train them. So they tried to hold off and add hours for the folks they do have employed. So that's one of the reasons why these labor market numbers are slower to rebound. So we call them lagging economic indicators, but they will. And I suspect that while GDP will take 1 to 2 years to return to its pre-COVID levels, again, barring any other catastrophe, that the unemployment rate, when will it return to the very low levels we saw in February? Well, I think that's going to take 2 to 4 years, again, assuming we don't have continued problems with this coronavirus. Another interesting question, as I am a labor economist, that I'm going to be following closely is, will companies move permanently to using employees at home? So remote work has become crucial during coronavirus, and it certainly can be cost saving, and in some cases, productivity increasing. And so it'll be interesting to see if businesses continue to do that and just change their business model. Now, people working at home are still considered employed. That won't change these numbers, but it will be interesting to see if the way our labor market operates is forever changed after this virus, but we shall see. All right, so now moving to more what we call soft data, and that's when we just use complete survey data, for example, is what we call soft data rather than retail sales. That's hard data. So what you see here is consumer sentiment and then something called a coincidence index, right? So consumer sentiment is just like the measure says. It's reported by the University of Michigan. We at Roanoke College create our own index using the same methodology, but it's only for Virginia. This is for the nation. And what it does is there's 5 questions that people answer. So they ask people a sample from across the nation, questions pertaining to their finances today compared to a year ago, how they think their finances will be in the future, how they think the overall economy will be in the future. And these measures are an important indicator of the economy because we get them every month, whereas we have to wait sometimes 3 months to get GDP numbers at the state level, sometimes 6 months. This comes out every month, so it's a little more frequent. Unemployment insurance claims is the most frequent data point because that's every week with only a 1-week lag. So what we see here is that, not surprising, consumer sentiment does a good job. People know when the economy is not doing well, right? And so when they get called up and asked these questions about their finances, if they lost their job or their friend lost their job, they're not going to feel so good about the economy. And so it's not surprising that in recessions, you see consumer sentiment fall, right? And those are those gray bars. I went back to 1990 for this graphic, so it got another recession in there. And so consumer sentiment did fall substantially when we moved into this kind of COVID era, because people were concerned. Some had lost their jobs, some had lost hours of work, and so they weren't as optimistic about our economy as they had been just 1 month before. And so we saw a drop in confidence. Now, this other line you see on here is what we call the coincident index. So that's the red, more smooth line. And this is a predicted measure. We also do this at Roanoke College for Virginia. This is just for the United States. And it takes past data regarding the economy, such as labor market measures, so on and so forth, and then uses it with an equation to predict what this next month is going to be. So the nice thing about coincident indexes is it tells us before we get the actual data what we think is going to happen. So there's a 1 period prediction. Now again, it's a prediction, but if we look at this, you can see that people, when they responded to the consumer sentiment survey, were a little more worried than what our model predicts we should be. If the model, that red line, it dropped certainly, but by percentage terms, it dropped by less than consumer sentiment did. And so that says that, you know, where the truth is probably somewhere in between. So if we're looking forward in time, things are going to, what I take from this is things are going to take a little while to return to normal, but perhaps not as long as we think it will. Now, of course, there's problems with any prediction models like that red line you see there, because we haven't had a COVID-like recession before. So we don't have any of that built into that model. So it really is a prediction, but I take optimism from this measure. Now, on to other indicators. These are really fun. Because of technology and all the data that's collected with everything that we do, it gives us this great resource for information. And so Open Table, I bet a lot of you may have Open Table. They're not only in the United States, they're in countries across the world. And they record that information. And so one of the interesting things for using this during COVID is they have data available free to the public going back to the beginning of 2018. And so you can zoom in on this COVID era to see what have people been doing in restaurants, right? And so if you look at the most pertinent graph is the one on the left. And so that's what we call year on year, so that's the YOY, year on year reopened seated diners, and it's a percentage. So what this tells us is they give us this information for every day. So I pulled this on June 6th, so that's the latest metric you have there. And it tells us on that day, 1 year ago, how many seats are open in restaurants now compared to that same restaurant 1 year ago. So it gives us some insight as to how our economy through restaurants is opening up. And so you can see that it was quite low in May, but we had opened up, right? But we were lower than 40% in mid-May. Now we're closing in on 55%. So we're operating just over half of the capacity at restaurants that we were prior. Now these are only restaurants who have reopened, so it doesn't bias the data in that way. So we are reopening, people are going to restaurants. You can see that by the right-hand side graphic. And this is year on year seated diners. And so this just tells you how many people on each day are going to making a reservation at least. And it's online, in person, and takeout, I believe. Anything you can do on Open Table, they record it. And this is all of it. What they're doing today compared to 1 year ago. So this is where you can really see the effect of coronavirus, because you can see that the people really did not go to restaurants even if they were open. You can see this drop to almost 100% reduction. And it's starting to pick up, right? We're still way behind where we were a year ago, not surprising, but people are going back to restaurants. And again, by looking at that first graphic, just focusing on reopened restaurants, they are operating at just over half capacity. So the takeaway from all of this is that no matter what measure of the economy, this morning, the inflation report came out, and inflation, not surprising, was very low. So things aren't getting, on average, very expensive either, because people aren't buying things. So that number was fairly low. And I believe the Fed just announced, I'm trying to look at it out of the corner of my eye because the squawk box is on, the Fed left rates unchanged, I believe, in their latest announcement. I take this all as good sign. I think it's going to take some time for us to recover, but I think we're going to recover faster than many believe, and that is because our economy has strong underlying fundamentals. So we are not returning to a weak economy. Whoops, I went the wrong direction. And so that is what I have for you. I wanted to leave enough time for people to have questions and not to bore you too terribly with a bunch of economics.
Dr. Kassens, thank you so much. My overall takeaway is a positive one.
Yes.
So that's wonderful news. We have a couple questions so far. So I'd just like to read them to you and then give you time to address them. So our first question is from Nicole Riley. What industry sectors do you see having a harder time recovering?
Okay, so when COVID hit, the industries that were hit first and hit the hardest were things in retail, restaurants, and I showed you some information about Open Table. That's just restaurants, but retail and tourism, right? Because we were told by the government, stay home. And they were sending stimulus checks out essentially with the notion they wanted people to stay home. And so those industries were hit early and they were hit hard. Those are also industries that employ people with lower wages. And so a lot of those folks don't have a substantial amount of savings, right? And so if you're out of the job in those industries for a period of time, it really is a struggle. So those industries were hit hardest. I believe the restaurants, et cetera, will come back slowly. But as we saw, we're only operating at about half capacity. So certainly not if you go into a restaurant, I have, every other table is open, right? And so I'm here in North Carolina for right now. And so here in North Carolina, you can eat inside, but they only have every other table available. So that obviously cuts down on how many staff members they need. So while that employment is coming back, it's going to take some time. And so it really depends on the governors, for one, how quickly they reopen their states, and then also how confident people feel about going out. Then if you look at tourism, that I think will take a little bit longer to recover than restaurants, because that's more of especially if you're going on a big trip, that's a bigger financial obligation. And you're taking perhaps a greater roll of the die, if you will, instead of just going out for a quick bite to eat. Going on a week-long trip somewhere may take you a little while to feel comfortable doing that. So I think tourism, especially cruise lines and things like that, are going to take much longer to recover. Certainly, they're trying very hard. Norwegian Cruise Line stock skyrocketed yesterday because they're offering all kinds of deals. So they're trying to get people back, but that will take longer.
Dr. Kassens, would you want to unshare your screen so that folks can see you again as you're answering questions?
Let's see if I can figure out how to do that.
That's a good question.
If I just click on myself.
There you go.
Oh, did that work?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have a question from William Corso.
Hi, William.
She's excited that you're asking questions. Any exceptions of supply chain changes, diversifying manufacturing locations, for example, to reduce risk from future shock?
Okay, so this is Bill of Corso, we call him. He's a former economics student. So supply chain, that's not really my bailiwick, if you will, but obviously there were major supply chain issues when COVID hit, because we are an international economy, and so we get a lot of goods and services, or goods made abroad, and we bring them in and use them and sell them. And so a lot of domestic businesses may find that it's easier to start purchasing various inputs here in the US rather than buying them from abroad, especially if there's still disruptions. Now, China has seemed to have gotten itself back in the game, and that they are a country where we buy a lot of our inputs for various technologies. But then there's also the question of, will we have government policy saying that we can't buy? So Intel, for example, is concerned that they may not be able to sell their products to China, for example. So that would have nothing to do with the economy per se, rather government regulation. So there's a lot up in the air, some of it being policy related, which is still undecided. We have to wait for Washington to decide.
Okay, we have another question from Bill. With any permanent business closures, do we think they will be replaced quickly or follow that 1 to 2 year recovery period?
Well, if a business closed completely, you'd have to ask a couple of questions. One is, was the business struggling before COVID, right? Because for some businesses that they were just eking along for whatever reason, it could be poor management, it could be the demand for their product just isn't there anymore. Who knows? There's many reasons why businesses go out of business or struggle. But there were some that were eking along and then COVID hit and that was it. And so for those businesses, I suspect they won't try to reopen because they're not reopening a strong business, right? It may be better to sell whatever capital equipment you have and move elsewhere and decide to open up some other shop or work for somebody else. If you had a strong business but just happened to be hit particularly hard by COVID, whether it's because of where you live, maybe you lived in New York City and your business was hit very quickly and very hard. If you had a strong business before and the costs aren't too much to reopen, I suspect you will. So it all comes back to, do the individuals think they can make a profit going forward? And if they were struggling before, getting started again is going to be very expensive, and I doubt they'll do so.
Okay, we have a question from Joseph Hazel or Hazel, not sure how to pronounce his last name. Sorry, Joseph. A recent paper from the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago predicts that 40% of the jobs lost during COVID will not be coming back. Can you speak to the impact on consumer spending?
Sure. So I have not read that report. Very familiar with that institute. So anything out of Chicago versus with economics is excellent. But I have not read that report, so I don't know what model they were using. But if you do have jobs that are gone and those individuals that were in those jobs don't get new ones, then yes, there will be a negative impact on consumer spending. Now, our economy is dynamic. So it could be that there are businesses that come back or stayed open and come back with a vengeance because perhaps they have less competition, or they've just refined their production process. Maybe people working at home saves them money, so their costs are lower. Regardless, there could be the chance for people who lose their job in one business to find a job that's now open because of increased demand at another place. So, you can't, I'm sure that won't be true for everyone, but it's not a zero-sum game necessarily.
Dr. Kassens, we have a question from Tom England. Is the industrial impact of COVID-19 lagging the consumer impact?
Not quite sure what he means by that. So as far as, so if you're talking about where factories, et cetera, producing goods and services, and then we're going to see that impact later. It depends on the industry. We saw a lot of industries, businesses stayed open and produced things, whereas others closed down. Amazon, for example, they're not really an industrial producer, but they stayed open. If they had a lot of inventory, then they'll be disrupted to a lesser extent. If they don't have a lot of inventory and it takes them a while to get employees back, yes, there'll be a disruption, and that could take a little while for us to see.
I have another question from Nicole Riley. Any thoughts on how the additional debt of $3 trillion in additional federal spending will impact our economy, short-term or long-term?
Short-term, not much. I'm always more concerned with long-term issues with debt. I will preface by saying I'm not a monetary economist. I leave that to Bob Stauffer. But debt, there are many issues with debt. One of the many is that you have to repay that debt. And so there's interest on that debt. So any good old Henry Hazlitt wrote a book, Economics in One Lesson, many decades ago, and he always talks about the seen and the unseen. So all that money that goes towards repaying our debt isn't money going to something else. So it isn't going to public education. It's not going to various infrastructure projects. But we don't know that because we don't see it, of course. So that's one of the long-term costs of debt. And the more debt you're in, the larger your payments are going to be. Now, for the United States, most of our debt is to ourselves. And so it's just kind of moving some money around. Doesn't mean it's okay, but it's not as big of an issue as it would be if, say, foreign countries owned all of our debt.
Okay, our next question is from Kevin Long. In your opinion, which talent pipelines need the most attention as we look down the road to recovery?
I guess I would say those areas that we think are going to be big growth areas in the future. So not looking backwards, but looking forwards. And I can tell you just by employers that are looking for our students at Roanoke College, when they're looking for a job, data analytics, for example, is something that employers really want individuals to have skills in. So if whether it's the government or the private sector or a combination of the two are going to focus on certain talent areas or skills, it should be those areas and getting started on it very early in life. So math being very important. You can't do data analytics without understanding math, and computer programming. That's all a part of that, along with the critical thinking and analysis that goes with it. So if I had to pick one, that is the area that I think we should really focus investment on education, starting at all levels, going to elementary all the way through college.
Dr. Kassens, I think our final question, for those that are not like myself, who are not economic experts by any stretch of the means, which economic journalists do you recommend reading or following for those of us who, just would like some general insight on an occasional basis?
Okay, so I recommend for my students, for example, whether they're in principals classes or even a little bit beyond, just because not only is it unbiased, which is hard to find these days, unbiased, but it's also entertaining. So not dry and boring like a lot of us economists are. I like a lot of podcasts. And so two podcasts I highly recommend that have to do with the economy, and they've done a lot about coronavirus, is number one, Freakonomics. It's a free podcast, and you can get it on all your streaming devices or platforms, sorry. And the other one is Planet Money. It's from NPR, but it is, no matter what you think of NPR, it is an unbiased source looking at various economic issues. Now, Freakonomics, those podcasts tend to be about an hour long, so a little bit more of a commitment, whereas Planet Money, their podcasts tend to be 20 minutes long. Both, I wouldn't say I like one over the other. I think they're both excellent, and that would be a great place to start.
So I lied. We have a couple other questions that have come in. I think you're going to want to hear from them. From Anthony Brantley. Hi, Anthony, up in Boston. What jobs do you think will thrive post-COVID?
Hello, Anthony, another one of my former students. Well, as I said before, I think analytics is going to be important. Our economy could be quite different from what we've seen before, and so it may be even more important to strategize how you allocate your labor force, how you distribute your inputs, your exports, all those things. And so big data and data analytics can help guide us and do that in a smart, efficient manner. And so I think those areas are going to be very important. I think this experience may draw attention to The fact that we have a big shortage of physicians and medical services in rural areas. So a place like Texas, for example, has a lot of rural areas, and it takes some people 3+ hours to get to a hospital. And so that's been an issue before, but I think this whole experience may have drawn attention to the fact that there are real disparities, and perhaps there can be incentives created through medical schools, et cetera. Maybe you get a scholarship to a medical school if you go serve X amount of time in some rural area that's greatly underserved. So those are some things I think would hopefully we see change.
Anthony also asked if you could speculate about what you think will happen in the housing market, especially around high-priced metropolitan areas.
So I know a few real estate agents, and housing is doing great. And I suspect we may see another boom in the housing market, just because there may be some people who don't feel comfortable yet going out and looking at a house. But as we continue to open up, they may feel more comfortable going out and looking. And the summer tends to be a hotter season, literally and figuratively, for going shopping for housing. The one area that I think may struggle is commercial real estate. If we see a lot of businesses moving more towards remote employees, there's no need for a very expensive office space in, say, downtown Manhattan. And so those areas may see a big trouble. So if you're looking for those spaces, it may be great in 6 months because prices may be very low. But I think if you hold any investments, et cetera, in the commercial real estate sector, I'd be worried.
So this probably be our last question from your colleague, Dr. Harry Wilson. It's a question that I actually had as well. Why is the stock market rallying so strongly when the economy still has major issues and earnings for many companies are so low?
Oh, Harry, you had to ask that. So the stock market, whenever I talk about the economy, especially in the last 6 months, I always say the stock market is its own animal. It seems to have nothing to do, I mean, it's not nothing to do, but not much to do with the overall economy. Now, some things make sense. You see Amazon stock just soaring. Makes sense. I bought a lot more things on Amazon. I bet a lot of other people did, since I couldn't go or didn't want to go to stores. So that makes sense. But then there's others that I can't tell you what investors are thinking. They're thinking something. There's a lot of smart people in that world, but I don't think I didn't talk in this webinar because I don't think it's a very good indicator of the current economy. I can't put my finger on why, because it should be, but it isn't.
Well, good. I'm glad he asked it and I didn't. So, so I think that's how we'll wrap up. Okay. Do you have any final comment you'd like to share before I do a little closing?
Yeah, I would say that I hope the takeaway from this is, while it's certainly we're not in great times right now, I think that the future is looking good. And so I know it's been frustrating for a lot of individuals. Certainly if you lost your job or you lost hours or someone did, it's been horrible. But I do think hope and good times are ahead, and I don't think we're going to have to wait that long to get there. So I hope you can walk away from this feeling a little bit better than you came into it, even though an economist was talking.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Kassens, we certainly do appreciate you sharing all this content with us today, and for all the viewers that we have out there. I encourage everyone to continue participating in our NOKELive events. Excuse me, we have 2 next week. Dr. Harry Wilson and Dr. Rodney Whitlock, he's one of our alum from class of 1987, will be talking about politics. And then, so that is Tuesday, June 16th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then on Thursday, Dr. Wilson will be joined by Dr. Taylor, another faculty member. And it's a behind the scenes look at our Roanoke College Polling Center and some of the recent polls they've done and the findings. So I think those will both be really energetic and thoughtful and interesting webinars. So again, you can find information on our NOKELive series by going to our website, at roanoke.edu/alumni. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, being a part of our second NOKELive webinar, and we wish you well, and go Maroons.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
coming.
so much.